My in-laws called me a failure until my quiet side business saved their home. I endured years of humiliation from wealthy in-laws who mocked my career. When financial disaster hit them, my hidden business success became their lifeline. The power reversal forces boundaries, self-respect, and quiet victory. The first time my father-in-law called me a failure to my face, I was holding a chipped mug of coffee that suddenly tasted like metal. We were standing in their marble kitchen, sunlight sliding across the polished countertops like it belonged there more than I ever did. Richard didn't even raise his voice. He said it the way someone comments on the weather, flat, observational, almost bored. Well, he shrugged, stirring his espresso, some people just aren't built to succeed. My wife, Elena, squeezed my arm under the table so lightly it almost felt like an apology she couldn't say out loud. I stared into my mug, watching the steam curl upward, and told myself it didn't matter. I told myself words were just words, but something small and tender folded inward in my chest. That wasn't the first comment, it was just the first one that landed. Before all of that, my life was simple in a quiet, ordinary way. Elena and I lived in a modest two-bedroom townhouse on the edge of the city, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbor's dog bark and smell garlic from someone else's dinner drifting through the hallway. Our couch sagged in the middle, the kitchen light flickered unless you twisted the switch just right. On Sunday mornings, we made pancakes and argued playfully about whether they needed blueberries or not. I worked a steady but unglamorous job doing logistics for a regional supply company. It paid the bills, it wasn't impressive. I liked the rhythm of it. Spreadsheets, shipments, predictable deadlines. I liked coming home at the same time every night, loosening my tie and cooking dinner with Elena while some old jazz record hummed in the background. Her parents were the opposite of modest. They lived in a gated neighborhood with fountains that never seemed to shut off, in a driveway longer than our entire block. Richard had built a real estate empire in his 40s. Her mother, Marlene, chaired charity boards and collected wine like trophies. Their dinner parties felt like museum exhibits. White plates, expensive candles, voices kept carefully low. From the beginning, I could tell I didn't fit. It wasn't just the clothes or the car I drove. It was the way Richard asked what I did for a living, eyebrows lifting just slightly when I answered. It was the way Marlene introduced me to friends as Elena's husband. He works in operations. The pause always felt heavier than the words. At first, I laughed it off. Elena assured me they were just blunt, just old school, just protective. I believed her because I wanted to. Love has a way of sanding down the edges of discomfort until you barely feel them, until one day you do. Every family dinner came with small cuts disguised as jokes. "Still at the same job?" Richard would say, swirling his wine. "Loyalty is admirable in dogs." Marlene once glanced at our anniversary gift to them, a framed photo of the whole family, and murmured, "Oh, how sentimental." I learned to smile through it. I learned to chew slowly. I learned to keep my shoulders relaxed even when my jaw tightened. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that after dinner dishes were washed and Elena fell asleep beside me, I stayed up in the soft blue glow of my laptop. I worked quietly on a small side business I'd started years earlier, an online logistics consulting service for small retailers who couldn't afford big firms. It grew slowly, carefully, like a plant you water in secret. A few clients became a few dozen. A few dozen became steady monthly contracts. I never talked about it, not because I was hiding something dark, but because it felt fragile, personal, like telling someone about a dream before it had learned how to stand. And honestly, part of me didn't want Richard's approval. I didn't want his measuring eyes anywhere near the one thing that felt truly mine. The first real crack appeared on a rainy Thursday evening. Elena came home unusually quiet. She set her keys down too carefully, hung her coat without humming like she usually did. The apartment smelled like wet pavement and leftover pasta. I asked how her parents were doing. She'd gone to visit them that afternoon. She hesitated just a second too long. "They're stressed," she said finally, opening the fridge and staring inside without taking anything out. "About what?" She shrugged. "Just investments, market stuff." Her voice was casual, but her shoulders were tight. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between us like static. That night, when she turned away from me in bed, I stared at the ceiling fan slowly circling shadows across the room. Something felt off. Not dramatic, not alarming, just a small shift in the air, like the pressure change before a storm. I told myself not to read into it. I was wrong. The next few weeks moved forward the way life usually does. On the surface, steady and predictable, but underneath, something subtle kept drifting out of alignment. Elena started checking her phone more often. Not in a suspicious way, exactly. More like someone waiting for a result they didn't want to see. Sometimes her smile would flicker off halfway through a conversation, like a light bulb struggling before dimming again. I'd catch her staring out the window in the mornings, coffee cooling untouched in her hands. One evening, as we folded laundry on the couch, I casually asked, "Have you talked to your parents lately?" She folded a towel too neatly, smoothed the edges twice. "Yeah," she said, "they're figuring some things out." I watched her fingers press into the fabric. The room smelled faintly of detergent and warm cotton. The TV murmured in the background, some cooking show neither of us was watching. "Figuring what out?" I asked gently. She met my eyes, then looked away. "It's complicated." That was new. Elena usually talked through everything. Her work stress, her family drama, even what a stranger said to her in the grocery line. "It's complicated" felt like a door quietly closing. I didn't push. Maybe that was my mistake. Or maybe I was protecting the fragile peace we'd built between us and her parents, the thin layer of politeness that kept their judgments from spilling into our marriage too much. The first real sign came during a Sunday lunch at their house. Marlene served lemon chicken on china plates that looked like they belonged in a glass cabinet. Richard barely touched his food. He kept tapping his fork against the edge of his plate, metal clicking softly, rhythmically. "So," he said suddenly, eyes on me, "how's your operations job?" I swallowed a bite. "Busy. End of quarter shipments." He leaned back, folding his arms. "And that's enough for you?" The room went quiet, except for the distant trickle of their indoor fountain. Alana shot him a warning glance. "Dad, I'm just asking." A man should aim higher than comfort. Something in his tone felt sharper than usual, less teasing, more edged. "I like what I do," I said evenly. Marlene sighed delicately. "Liking isn't the same as thriving." I felt the familiar heat behind my ears. But before I could respond, Richard added, almost casually, "Especially when emergencies come up. Savings matter. Stability matters." Elena's fork paused midair. "What emergencies?" she asked. Richard waved a hand. "Just hypotheticals," but his jaw tightened. The conversation drifted after that, but the unease lingered like a bad aftertaste. On the drive home, rain streaked the windshield in thin silver lines. Elena stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. "Your dad seemed tense," I said. She exhaled slowly. "They've got some properties that aren't doing well, a few bad loans. It'll probably work itself out." Probably. That word clung to me. A few nights later, I overheard Elena on the phone in the bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was brushing my teeth, the faucet running, but her voice carried. "I know," she whispered. "I don't know how bad it really is. Yes, I understand. No, I haven't told him yet." My chest tightened. I turned the water off too quickly, the silence suddenly loud. By the time I stepped into the bedroom, she was ending the call, slipping her phone under her pillow like a reflex. "Everything okay?" I asked. She smiled too fast. "Yeah, just my mom worrying about nothing." I wanted to believe her, but something in my gut had started quietly pacing. The truth arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a voicemail from Richard himself. His voice was strained, not angry, not mocking, tired, thin. "Listen," he said, clearing his throat. "We need to talk, all of us. Tonight. It's important." Elena listened to the message beside me, her face pale. At their house that evening, the lights felt dimmer than usual. The fountain was off, no background music, no wine poured. We sat around their long dining table, the glossy surface reflecting our anxious faces like a distorted mirror. Richard rubbed his temples. Marlene clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "We're in trouble," Richard said, quietly. Silence swallowed the room. A major development project fell through. The lender pulled out. We're over-leveraged on 3 properties. The bank wants immediate restructuring. Marlene's voice trembled. If we can't cover the bridge payments, they'll start foreclosure proceedings. Elena's hand found mine under the table. Her fingers were cold. How much time do you have? Elena asked. 3 months, Richard said. Maybe less. The word foreclosure echoed in my head like a dropped glass. I waited for the punchline, the bailout plan, the safety net. This was the man who once bragged about never owing anyone anything. The man who called people like me cautious and small. Richard finally looked at me. We may need help. The sentence felt heavier than any insult he'd ever thrown at me. My heart thudded, not with triumph, with something closer to dread, because I knew something they didn't. And the next choices I made would change every relationship in that room. The room felt suddenly too small for the truth sitting inside my chest. Richard's eyes lingered on me, not with his usual judgment, but with something unfamiliar. Calculation mixed with reluctant humility. Marlene's lips pressed into a thin line, as if holding back 1,000 unspoken fears. Elena squeezed my hand once, grounding me. How can we help? Elena asked quietly. Richard cleared his throat. We're talking to banks, of course, selling off a few assets, but liquidity is tight. We may need a private loan to stabilize the payments while we restructure. My stomach tightened. A private loan? From who? His gaze didn't leave me. You? I said before I could stop myself. The word came out flatter than I intended. He nodded slowly. I know, it's unconventional. Marlene added softly, we wouldn't ask if it weren't serious. My mind raced, not with panic about money, but with memory. His voice calling me a failure, the way he'd laughed about loyalty being for dogs, the casual dismissals that had stacked up over years like invisible bruises. I thought about my quiet nights hunched over spreadsheets, building something brick by brick, while they sipped wine under chandeliers. I thought about never mentioning it because I didn't want it measured, judged, diminished, and I thought about what it meant to be asked for help by someone who had never once respected me. I don't have that kind of money, I said carefully. Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I assumed as much. But even a smaller amount could help bridge. I didn't say I don't have access to money, I interrupted, my voice surprisingly steady. I said I don't have it sitting in my personal savings. Elena turned toward me, eyes wide. What do you mean? The room went quiet in that fragile, held breath way. I swallowed. I run a small consulting business on the side. It's been doing well. Marlene blinked. How well is well? I hesitated. Numbers suddenly felt intimate, like undressing in public. 7 figures in annual revenue. The silence cracked open like ice. Elena stared at me. You never told me. I didn't want to make it a thing, I said softly. It started small. I reinvested everything. It just grew. Richard leaned back slowly, disbelief etched across his face. You're telling me you're sitting on a business making more than most of my properties? I nodded once. Marlene let out a shaky breath. Why would you hide that? I wasn't hiding. I just wasn't advertising. The air shifted. The power dynamic in the room tilted almost imperceptibly, like furniture rearranged in the dark. Richard leaned forward now, voice careful. Then perhaps this solves everything. You could loan us the amount we need. Short term. We'd repay with interest. Elena's eyes were on me, searching. How much do you need? I asked. He named a number that would have terrified me 2 years ago. Now it was manageable. Not painless, but possible. I need time to think, I said. Richard nodded, masking urgency behind forced calm. Of course. On the drive home, the car was filled with the soft hum of tires on asphalt. Elena kept glancing at me like she was seeing a new version of a familiar face. You really built all that by yourself? She asked. I smiled faintly. Mostly at night, with a lot of coffee. She shook her head in disbelief, then laughed softly. I wish you'd told me. I know. I wasn't trying to keep secrets. I just didn't want it to change how people saw me. She reached for my hand. It changes how I see you, in a good way. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the ceiling fan again, watching shadows rotate like slow thoughts. Could I help them? Yes. Should I? That question felt heavier. Money has a way of revealing the shape of relationships. If I handed over a lifeline without boundaries, would respect finally arrive? Or would it only deepen a pattern of entitlement? The next morning, I called my business attorney and my accountant. We ran scenarios, risk exposure, safeguards, loan structures. By afternoon, I had clarity, not just financially, but emotionally. That evening, we met again at Richard's house. I can help, I said calmly once we were seated, but not informally. Richard frowned slightly. What do you mean? I'll structure this as a secured loan through my company. Proper contracts, collateral, clear repayment schedule, no verbal promises. Marlene stiffened. That seems cold. It's professional, I replied. This protects everyone. Richard hesitated. Pride flickered across his face. Then necessity overtook it. Fine, if that's what it takes. There's one more condition, I added. They both looked at me. I won't tolerate disrespect anymore. Not toward my work, not toward my character. If we're entering a financial partnership, there has to be mutual respect. The words felt strange and powerful leaving my mouth. Not angry, not defensive, simply true. Richard studied me for a long moment. Then quietly, fair. The contracts were signed a week later. Funds transferred. Their mortgage payments stabilized. Foreclosure paused. But the emotional bill had only just begun coming due. Because money may solve numbers, but it doesn't erase years of quiet damage. And the real test was still ahead. The change didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came in small, almost awkward adjustments. The way Richard cleared his throat before speaking to me. The way Marlene asked my opinion on things she used to dismiss. Respect, when it's learned late in life, often feels like a foreign language spoken carefully, syllable by syllable. At Sunday dinners, the table felt subtly rearranged, even though the chairs were in the same place. So, Richard said one evening, cutting into his steak, how's the consulting side growing? Consulting side. Not operations job, not that little thing you do. Consulting side. I answered calmly, describing a new regional contract, the expansion into automation tools. He listened, actually listened. No interruptions, no smirks. Marlene even asked, do you think we should diversify more digitally with our leasing strategy? It was strange being treated like a resource instead of a liability, but gratitude and pride rarely mix cleanly. A month later, during a small family gathering, Richard's brother, Alan, made an offhand joke about bailing out rich people who can't manage their own money. His tone was light, but his eyes flicked toward me. Richard's jaw tightened. For a split second, the old version of him looked ready to laugh along. Instead, he said firmly, he didn't bail us out. We partnered responsibly. Show some respect. The room went quiet. Alan muttered an apology and changed the subject. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not triumph, but relief. Still, boundaries were tested. Marlene began offering unsolicited suggestions about how I should reinvest my profits. Richard once casually mentioned how family loans could maybe be flexible on interest timing. I gently but consistently reinforced the agreements. Not defensively, not aggressively, just calmly. The contract outlines the terms. Let's stick to what we agreed. Each time there was a pause, then acceptance. 3 months passed, then 6. Properties were sold strategically, debt reduced, cash flow stabilized. The crisis slowly deflated like a storm cloud losing its rain. One evening, Elena and I sat on our small balcony, the city humming below us. The air smelled faintly of summer asphalt and grilled food drifting from somewhere nearby. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. Me too, I admitted. Not for the money, but for the way I hadn't shrunk myself this time. The real public consequence arrived unexpectedly at Richard's annual charity gala. It was held in a restored historic ballroom, gold trim, crystal chandeliers, live string quartet tuning their instruments. Elena and I stood near a tall cocktail table, sipping sparkling water. A small group gathered around Richard, donors, board members, local business leaders. I stayed slightly behind Elena, content to observe. Someone asked Richard about the recent restructuring rumors swirling quietly in their circles. He straightened his jacket. We went through a difficult quarter, but we adapted. Then, after a brief pause, he gestured toward me. My son-in-law's company provided the strategic financing and advisory support that helped us stabilize. The words landed gently but powerfully. Heads turned toward me, curious smiles, nods of interest. I felt heat rise in my face. Not embarrassment, but something like quiet validation. One man extended his hand. Impressive. I'd love to hear more about what you do. For the first time, Richard didn't dominate the conversation. He let me speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't minimize. Later that evening, as the quartet played a soft waltz and guests drifted toward the dance floor, Richard approached me alone. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice steady but sincere. "I misjudged you. I was wrong." The admission felt heavier than any praise. I nodded. "Thank you." He added, "I let my own definition of success blind me. You built something real." We stood there for a moment, two men recalibrating a long-standing imbalance. It didn't erase the past, but it rewrote the future. When the final loan payment cleared months later, Richard sent me a short message. "Debt settled. Thank you for believing when we couldn't." Simple, honest. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Not perfect, not dramatic, just healthier. Family dinners became easier, conversations lighter, boundaries respected. I still worked my day job, by choice now, not necessity. I still built my business quietly, but no longer invisibly. The humiliation that once followed me like a shadow slowly faded into something less sharp, a memory instead of a wound. And yet, the story didn't end in triumph. It ended in perspective, because power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly in the background, patient, steady, waiting for the right moment to stand. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving others wrong, it's finally believing in your own worth. The strange thing about healing is that it rarely feels like a finish line. There was no dramatic celebration when the last payment cleared. No speeches, no champagne, just a quiet email confirmation on a Tuesday morning while I sipped coffee at my desk. The office printer hummed. Someone laughed down the hall. Life continued in its ordinary, unremarkable way, and somehow that felt exactly right. That evening, Elena and I cooked dinner together the way we always had. Garlic hit warm olive oil and filled the kitchen with that comforting, familiar scent. She stirred the sauce while I chopped basil, the soft, rhythmic tap of the knife grounding me. "You okay?" she asked, glancing at me. "Yeah," I said, "just thinking." We ate at our small kitchen table, knees brushing, listening to the faint hum of traffic through the open window, the same chipped mugs, the same flickering light. Nothing outwardly had changed, and yet everything inside felt steadier. Later, I stepped onto the balcony alone. The city lights shimmered like scattered constellations below. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded into the distance. I rested my elbows on the railing and let the cool night air settle against my skin. I thought about the years I spent shrinking myself in other people's rooms, about how easy it is to confuse quiet with weakness, how often we let other people's definitions shape the way we see our own value. I realized that my side business had never really been about money. It was about building something that belonged to me, proof that consistency and patience still mattered in a world obsessed with spectacle. Richard and Marlene didn't become different people overnight. Richard was still opinionated. Marlene still loved her curated perfection, but the edge was gone. The casual dismissals had softened into something closer to mutual regard. We laughed more now. We listened better. One Sunday afternoon, Richard asked if I'd help him review a new development proposal, not because he needed rescuing, but because he respected my perspective. We sat at their long dining table, papers spread out, sunlight streaming through the windows. He offered me coffee instead of wine. Small things, but meaningful. Afterward, he clapped me lightly on the shoulder. "You've got good instincts." It was such a simple sentence, and yet it healed something old. Elena and I also changed. We talked more openly about money, about ambition, about fears we'd both quietly carried. Trust deepened not because of the business success, but because we learned to be fully seen by each other. One evening, curled together on the couch, she said softly, "I'm glad you didn't let them define you." I smiled. I almost did. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Deadlines still stressed me out, clients still canceled unexpectedly, family dynamics still required patience, but the internal weight, the constant quiet proving was gone. I had learned that dignity doesn't come from out-earning someone else's expectations. It comes from knowing your own worth, even when no one is clapping. Sometimes I think about that moment in Richard's marble kitchen years ago, the chipped mug, the metallic taste in my mouth, the sentence that lingered like a bruise. If I could step back into that moment now, I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't defend. I'd simply stand a little taller and trust the slow, invisible work I was already doing. Because success doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, steady, patient, undeniable. And sometimes the greatest reversal isn't external power shifting hands. It's the moment you finally stop needing anyone else's permission to feel enough. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been quietly building something while the world looked the other way, know this: your story doesn't need to be loud to be meaningful. Would you have helped them if you were in my place? Or would you have walked away? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing or supporting the channel so more real, human stories can continue to be told.